Good evening and welcome to today's JNet class on Pesach. Today we will discuss several aspects of the Seder, of the Haggadah. What is it that we are trying to accomplish at the Seder, and how do we go about doing that? So, just as a short introduction, I would like to point out that Pesach is called Zman Cheruseinu, the time of our liberation. It is not called Zman Cherus Avaseinu, the time of our forefathers' liberation, but Zman Cheruseinu, the time of our liberation, because when we celebrate Pesach, it is not only in order to remember what happened to our forefathers, but it is actually an opportunity for us to relive that experience ourselves. Our sages tell us that when God created the world, He created a date of liberation, and that is when the Jews left Egypt, which was the 15th of Nisan. And every year when that date comes around again, it is an opportunity for us to free ourselves from our own Egypt, our own limitations. So that is basically what we try to do at the Seder of the Pesach Seder, to try to evaluate and understand our own personal Egypt and how to free ourselves from it. So we'll discover a few of these aspects. We'll talk about a few of these aspects of what we do at the Seder, what we say at the Seder, and how it can apply to our daily lives today. So let's begin with the basic mitzvahs that we have at the Seder meal, which consists of eating matzah. We have 3 matzahs, 4 cups of wine. We have to eat maror. That is the obligation that we have. Those are the culinary obligations that we have at the Seder meal. To eat the matzah, drink wine, and to eat the maror. Eating matzah is of biblical origin. There's a biblical obligation to eat at least a kazayas of matzah, 28 grams of matzah, the first night of Pesach and the second night of Pesach, as a result of that. And there is a rabbinical obligation to drink 4 cups of wine in the course of the Seder, each cup containing at least 86 milliliters of wine. An easy way to remember it is it's the numerical value of the word kos, cup, and which must be drunk in one time, each cup. And those 4 cups represent primarily the 4 expressions of liberation that God uses when He talks to Moshe and tells him to go to the Pharaoh and to tell him to free the Jews from Egypt. Actually, it's when he tells Moshe to go to the Jews and tell them that he's going to free them from Egypt. So, to remember these 4 expressions of freedom, our sages instituted that we drink 4 cups of wine, which must be drunk while we lean on our left side, representing freedom. Leaning represents freedom. The left side is because of the way our throat is structured in order not to choke. And then we have the maror, which we eat also without the Korban Pesach. It is not of biblical origin. The biblical obligation is to eat it together with the Korban Pesach, but since we don't have the Korban Pesach today, it is only a rabbinical obligation. So let's explore a little bit the matzahs and the wine, which represents something very fascinating, because we find that the 3 matzahs represent the 3 patriarchs, and the 4 cups of wine represent the 4 matriarchs. The 3 matzahs represent the patriarchs Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the 4 cups of wine represent the 4 matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. So the question is, why not the other way around? First of all, what is the connection between matzah and patriarchs and wine and matriarchs? And why don't we have, let's say, 3 cups of wine to remember the patriarchs and 4 matzahs to commemorate the matriarchs. So the Rebbe explains something very interesting here, and that is that one of the basic differences between matzah and wine represents the basic difference between the paternal role in the family and the maternal role in the family. The difference between matzah and wine is that matzah has no taste. In other words, matzah must be made out of flour and water, and you cannot add anything that will give it any taste. It's called lechem oini, the bread of poverty, and if you add anything to it that will give it taste, eggs or anything else, or juice, then it becomes matzah shira, and that it cannot be used for the minimum amount that we need to eat at the Seder night. It has to be something that has no taste added to it, and it's just flour and water. Wine, on the other hand, is characterized by the taste. Wine has very exquisite taste. Wine is, as a matter of fact, if you have different types of wine at a table, which were brought during the course of the meal, you have to make a special bracha for each type of wine. In other words, wine is distinguished because of its unique taste. So here we have the difference. Matzah has no taste, wine has taste. What does this have to do with father and mother? Because this represents two pathways or two requisites to be able to free ourselves from our own limitations. The first, we have the matzah, which is something that has no taste, and the idea is discipline, Kabbalah's oil, accepting God's yoke without necessarily understanding or feeling or appreciating it. So that is the first step for us to be able to free ourselves from ourselves in order to access ourselves. In other words, in order for us to be able to reach our truest potential, we have to be able to free ourselves from our limited selves. And that is, first and foremost, by discipline. If we will only do that which we understand or feel, then we will always be limited by that which we understand and feel. If we are cognizant of the fact that our understanding and feeling is limited, and therefore, in order to free ourselves from the limitations inherent in our understanding and feeling, we need to subscribe to a discipline that will take us beyond those limitations. So then we are on a path to freedom. That is Kabbalah's oil, accepting God's yoke, accepting a discipline which is not subjected to our understanding and feeling. But what happens is you cannot live your whole life just based on discipline. I mean, you have to develop a taste for what you're doing, and that is where the wine comes into the picture. And that is that although we need the discipline to start the process, but at some point along the line, our own understanding and feeling has to kick in as well in order for us to appreciate that which we are doing independently of our understanding and feeling. But nevertheless, when we understand and feel what we're doing, it adds a whole different enthusiasm to what we're doing and a whole different vitality to what we're doing. So that is the relationship between, those are the two key ingredients in order to free ourselves from our own limitations, to have the discipline represented by the matzah, and to have the understanding and feeling represented by the wine. That is also why the connection between matzah and fathers and wine and mothers. As Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest man of all time, said, Shema b'ni musar avicha, al titesh Torah simecha. So the fathers, listen, my son, to the musar, to the admonishment of your father, and do not abandon the teachings of your mother. So basically, the understanding is that a mother is one who nurtures the potential of her children, whereas the father is the one who imposes discipline, imposes fear. We're not talking about imposing terror, obviously. We're talking about imposing fear, that the child's afraid to upset his father, He's afraid his father will get upset, and that is sometimes enough or is necessary to keep the children on the straight and narrow. But they need also to have the nurturing that the mother gives them. So you need both. And this is something that the Torah recognizes. We find that there are two commandments that the Torah tells us regarding our relationship to our parents. We must honor them and we must fear them. And the Torah says, one of the Ten Commandments, honor your father and your mother. It first mentions father and then mentions mother. Why? So our sages explain, because a person naturally honors his mother more than his father, because she pampers him more than the father does. So that is why the Torah has to emphasize more the honor to the father, because the honor to the mother comes more naturally. But when it comes to fear, the Torah says, Ish imay v'aviv tiro, that a person must fear his mother and his father. And it first mentions the mother, then the father, for the same reason, because a person naturally fears his father more than he fears his mother, and that is why the Torah puts more emphasis on the mother regarding fear. So we see we have these two components in our relationship to our parents, and each one of our parents fulfills a specific role, a complementary role. They're complementary roles, the nurturing and the discipline, and that is represented by the matzah and the wine. The matzah, which has no taste, represents the discipline of the father, which one must have in order to grow in life. And the wine represents the nourishing, the nurturing that the mother gives to bring out one's understanding and feeling, which makes the whole experience more personal and not impersonal as an imposed discipline would do. So that is the first thing. Also, we can talk about the maror. The maror is bitterness, and an important thing to stress here is what it explains in Chassidus, the difference between depression and sadness. Atzvos and merirus. Atzvos is sad, is depression. Merirus is bitterness. And the difference is, when a person is sad, it very often might be justified. He's sad because of something that went wrong, something that is wrong, something that should cause pain and sadness. But what happens is, as a result of that, it pushes one to fix what's wrong, or to prevent that from happening again, or to overcome that somehow. So it becomes a positive catalyst. In other words, the pain moves you to do something. If you wouldn't have the pain in your tooth, you wouldn't go to the dentist to fix it. So the pain in your tooth is a catalyst for fixing the situation. Whereas depression is the lack of feeling. In other words, you're numb. You're totally out, you're totally numb, and therefore you're not motivated to do anything. So basically, the idea of eating maror is, the lesson behind it is that the importance of feeling pain, of feeling that something is wrong, because that will move you to make it right. In contradistinction to a situation where you don't feel anything, where you're totally unplugged and you're totally out, and that won't get you anywhere. So that is actually a litmus test. If your sadness is positive or negative, if it is something you should pay attention to or something you should simply push out of your mind, and the litmus test is the conclusion of your feeling positive or negative? Is the conclusion of your pain that you must go and do something about it? Or is the conclusion of your pain is that nothing can be done? So if the conclusion of your sadness is that you're not going to do anything because nothing can be done, that is, to paraphrase our sages, yush shalei midas. Giving up is a result of lack of das, of maturity, lack of understanding. Whereas if your pain pushes you to do something to fix the situation, that is a healthy pain. So maror is actually one of the important elements in liberating yourself from yourself when you feel pained by your situation, and it moves you to move away from that situation to a better place, their pain is a very positive key, an important key in your self-liberation. So we have the matzah on one hand, which is the discipline which is necessary for somebody to move beyond this comfort zone. The wine, which represents the understanding and feeling, which is important for a person to do whatever God tells him to with vitality and enthusiasm. And then you have the mirror, which is there to teach us that we have to be sensitive to reality, and sensitive in the way that empowers us and mobilizes us and pushes us to improve the situation, rather than just to cry about it and absolve ourselves from doing anything because the situation is so horrible. Talking about this brings to mind the story the Torah tells us about Yosef and Binyamin when they met after decades of not having seen one another. So Torah tells us that Yosef fell on the neck of Binyamin and cried, and Binyamin fell on Yosef's neck and cried. So why is it important to know that they each fell on one another's neck? Why is that relevant to the story? Why is it relevant to us? So Rashi brings down that at that point, both of them, Yosef and Binyamin, foresaw the future destructions of the temples, each of which would be on the other's territory. Mishkan Shiloh, which would be in Yosef's territory, and the Beis Hamikdash, which would be partially built on Binyamin's territory. So, being that they each foresaw prophetically the eventual destruction of the temple and the other's territory, they cried. What does that do with the neck? Because the Beis Hamikdash fulfilled the same function that a neck does. The function of the neck is to connect the head with the body. So too is the function of the Beis Hamikdash, the connection between Hashem and the world. So each one of them cried on the other's neck represents the idea of crying because of the destruction of the temple which they foresaw in the other's territory. So the Rebbe asks a simple question. Being each one of them had a destruction in their own territory, why would they cry for the destruction that they foresaw in their brother's territory rather than for the destruction that they foresaw in their own territory? Obviously, if the destruction in their brother's territory pained them to the point of crying, the destruction in their own territory should have pained them even more, and should have overshadowed the pain that they would have because of what they foresaw in their brother's territory. So the Rebbe analyzes this very interestingly and says that is crying a good thing or a bad thing? And the answer is depends. It depends if you can do something about the situation or if you cannot do something about the situation. If you cannot do something about the situation, crying is a good thing. It relieves you of the intolerable pain. But if it's a situation where you can do something about it, crying will only distract you. It'll make you feel better, and therefore you won't feel compelled to do something about the situation. When is it that you can do something about the situation? When it's in your own territory. When you see destruction in your own life, that is something that you can deal with. It that is up to you to change and to address. Whereas when you see destruction in somebody else's life, it doesn't depend on you to fix it. You might try to help him, you might bring his attention to it, you can say some tillim for him, but ultimately it doesn't depend on you. So therefore, crying is the natural thing to do because you're pained by something that you cannot do anything about. So this is basically, that is why Yosef cried for Binyamin, Binyamin cried for Yosef, because when it came to each one's destruction in his own territory, crying wasn't the appropriate thing to do, because you have to do something about it. So when the pain brings you to do something, that is positive. When it's something that you cannot do anything about, crying is the only thing you can do. That is why we find that when Yosef met Yaakov, it says that Yaakov, it doesn't mention Yaakov crying. So the Zohar says, why wasn't he crying? Because at that moment he said, Shema Yisrael. The Rebbe explains, because being that all the destructions of the temples were all in Yaakov's territory, because all of Israel is Yaakov's territory, it was only divided amongst his sons, but it was all the sons were extension of him. So that is why he said Shema Yisrael. So the different explanations why he said Shema Yisrael. Some say that it's because that he wanted to channel all that feeling of meeting Yosef into expressing his love for God rather than just expressing his fatherly love for his son. But Rebbe explains that the idea here was that Yaakov was trying to neutralize somehow the destruction of the temple, because since the function of the temple was to manifest Hashem's presence in the world, the destruction of the temple implied somehow diminishing that manifestation. Yaakov, by saying Shema Yisrael, was counteracting the effect of the destruction of the temple. So, going back to the point what we're trying to say here is regarding the maror, that pain and sadness is positive when it brings you, when it motivates you to do something about the situation. If you wouldn't be pained by it, you wouldn't be motivated to do something. But if it's a kind of pain that paralyzes you and makes you feel that you cannot do anything about it because the situation is so horrible, that is something that does not belong in the Seder. That is not a kosher maror. That is not the type of maror that belongs to the Seder, because it's the type of maror which immobilizes you, and not the type that mobilizes you, so therefore it has no place in the process of liberation. So, let's move on to another element of the Seder. And the very interesting thing that we find is the role that the four sons play in the Seder. We start off one of the main parts of the Seder, which is to narrate to the story of our slavery and Exodus, to relate the story to our children, to the future generations. That is one of the major stages of the Seder night. And it starts off with a child asking 4 questions. And as a result of his 4 questions, we go into the whole answer and the whole story, which is a very powerful lesson in education. And that is more important than giving our children answers is teaching them how to ask questions. Because if a person has a question, he will look for the answer. If he doesn't have the question, then he's not interested in your information or your answers. So the most important, crucial element in education is to provoke the curiosity of the child, to provoke his interest, and once he has interest in something, he will already look for the answer. Whereas, like we mentioned, if he doesn't have the question, then your answer will just make no difference there. So that's one important lesson we learn. Then we find that the Haggadah talks about 4 sons. In other words, that's another important lesson, and that is that we should not answer questions, we should answer people. In other words, you can have 4 people coming with the same question, and each one has something else in mind. So the first thing that you must ascertain when somebody asks a question is, what is the question behind the question? In other words, what is motivating him to ask that question? I mean, there's a very famous story of Rav that someone came to ask him at Pesach if you're allowed to use milk instead of wine for the 4 cups, because milk also has the capacity to make somebody sleepy, so it has some kind of characteristics that wine has. So the rabbi told this young woman who came to ask the question, so yes, you can use milk instead of wine. And then he asked the secretary to go to this woman's family, to her home, and deliver either all the money necessary to buy food or to just deliver food packages containing all the food necessary for the whole family. So when the man looked at the rabbi with a quizzical look, he says, listen, if she's asking me if she can use milk instead of wine, that means they have no chicken, they have no meat, otherwise how would she be able to use milk? So obviously it's not just a question about the milk, but understand that if she has a question about the milk, there's a much more important question behind that question, and that is how will we be able to celebrate the Seder properly. So when somebody comes to ask you a question, any question, you must be sensitive to understand what's behind the question. And don't just answer a question, answer the person. That is why the Haggadah teaches us the 4 sons. Each one comes to the Seder. each one has a different question, each one has a different issue. You have the Chacham, the wise son, who is a sophisticated fellow, who's motivated, studious, he's a sage, and his questions are very advanced, are nuanced. He wants to understand very specific details and concepts of the Seder. But then you have the Russia, who is the rebellious one, who comes and says, "Oh, what are you guys doing here? What is this? What are you doing?" And since he says "you" with that attitude, so the Haggadah tells us, teach him a lesson, tell him that this is what God did for me, and not for you, because if you would have been there, you wouldn't have left Egypt. So at face value, it doesn't really sound very pedagogic, very educational. I mean, it's very not Chabad. A guy comes and says, "What are you guys doing?" And you say, "Well, it's not for you, it's for us, get out of here." I mean, what exactly is going on here? So the Rebbe explains this very beautifully and says the following. This is actually the issue that the rebellious or the evil son has. He says, "What did you invite me to the Seder for? What are you guys doing here? I don't understand anything. I don't feel anything. I don't even believe in all of this. I mean, what am I doing here? Why do you think it's important for me to be here? I don't relate to this at all." So the answer to him is, listen, fella, if you would have been in Egypt with this attitude, you wouldn't have left Egypt. But now, after Mount Sinai, after God chose us to be his people, now we belong, and we are Jewish, if we like it or not, we understand it or not, we believe it or not. It doesn't depend on us to be. It depends on us to understand, feel it, and appreciate it. That, yes. But we are Jewish because we are part of God's chosen people, precisely because he chose us. And that doesn't depend on us. So therefore, you have a connection here as much as any one of us has, because you have a neshama. You have a soul, which is essentially identical to any one of us sitting here. The only difference is, to what point have you discovered its relevance in your life, and to what point do you understand it, feel it, or believe it? But it doesn't change the fact that you have it and you're connected. So therefore, it's not an invitation for him to leave the Seder, but quite the contrary. It's a challenge for him now to try to access that essence that he has, and which connects him to everybody else at the Seder. So that is, I think, a very powerful insight into this particular exchange, that if you read it at face value, seems to be totally different than the way the Rebbe teaches it to us, not just academically, but also in our approach to any Jew that we find. That even though they might not see their connection, it is our job to help them become aware of that condition and show them how to reach that neshama of theirs, and how to transform the cognitive dissonance into a cognitive consonance. That what they think and feel consciously should express what they are essentially. Then we have another thing in the another very interesting lesson in the Seder, and with this I will conclude. And that is a story that the Haggadah tells us about Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, the Haggadah tells us about the group of sages that were sitting and spending the Seder night together and discussing different aspects of the Exodus. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, "I am as if I were 70 years old, and I have never merited that my opinion should be accepted." Which is, my opinion is that we must mention Exodus at night, not just during the day, but also at night. And that was his opinion, but other sages didn't feel that there was an obligation to mention it at night. You had an obligation to mention it once a day, but not once in the day and once at night. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah said that he felt that it should be mentioned once during the day, once at night, but never was able to convince anybody of his opinion until Ben Zoma came and found the basis for it in the Torah. Because the Torah says, "L'man tizkar seim tzeischa meretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha." Because the Torah says you must remember the days of your leaving Egypt, all the days of your life. So Yemei Chayecha, the days of your life, refer to the days. Kol Yemei Chayecha, what is the extra word kol? All the days of your life? Because if it wouldn't say all the days of your life, why would we think it's anything less than all the days of your life? So the word all comes to add something. What can it add to all the days of your life? It means the nights as well. So that extra word comes to add something to the days of your life, which is the nights of your life. So therefore you must mention leaving Egypt once during the day and once at night, which we actually do when we say the Shema. So, and the lesson here is very interesting, and that is because days and nights represent two different situations in a person's life. Day is when things are going well and he's successful. So then you must mention leaving Egypt, because the idea there is that you must challenge yourself to go beyond your success. You were successful, go beyond that and be even more successful. And then the nights represent the points, low points in your life, when everything looks bleak and things look horrible. There we must mention leaving Egypt, because the lesson there is you can leave your situation. In other words, your situation, don't take it as something which cannot be changed. You can leave the pit that you find yourself in. So either during the day we challenge ourselves to go beyond the peak we have attained, and at night the idea is to remember leaving Egypt, that when we are in a low point in our life, to remember that we can leave the situation we find ourselves in. We can ask ourselves, why do we think Mashiach will come? If it didn't come in previous generations, when our forefathers were around, or our grandparents were much more pious than we are, why do we think that he'll come in our times? So the Rebbe explains, based on this lesson from Eliezer ben Azariah, that since we are all recycled neshamas, we have been here before, we have merits that are accumulated that are far beyond that which we have generated in this lifetime. So therefore, we cannot just measure our merits based on this life, but we should also add to it the merits accumulated from previous lifetimes. So the question is, how do we know that in the previous life we were righteous? Maybe in the previous life we were sinners, and therefore we don't only have the weight of the sins committed in this lifetime, but we also have to add to that the sins committed in previous lifetimes. So the Rebbe answers a very simple answer and says that the only thing that passes on from one lifetime to another are the mitzvahs that we do, the positive acts that we do, because they have an intrinsic value, an eternal value that never expires. Whereas the value of a sin that we do only has a subjective value for the person at that moment, but doesn't have a real value. And when we do tshuva, that erases the residual effect of those behaviors. And the death itself also erases the impact of those behaviors, so they do not transfer from one lifetime to the other. So all we have in our account are the accumulated merits of previous lives, like we see in the case of Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, and therefore we should indeed expect Mashiach to come any given moment, because of all the accumulated mitzvahs that have been generated throughout all previous lifetimes and previous generations. May this Pesach be the last one in Golus, or actually the first one in Geula without being the last one in Golus, if Mashiach comes. If you're watching this before Pesach, so Mashiach will come and take us all to Eretz Yisrael, where we will be able to celebrate Pesach as it was meant to be originally, in the Beis HaMikdash, together with Mashiach.